Part 2. So I got a little bit of a, I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint, and I'm not really going to do a PowerPoint. I got another little presentation, but I thought I'd bring some slides from my time at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation when I started and ran Generation Screwed to show you afterwards, just because I think PowerPoints are kind of boring, but there's some really cool graphs that can illustrate a couple of the points that I'm going to make during this presentation. So more government, more problems. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Those famous words, of course, were spoken by US President Ronald Reagan in 1981, but they are as true now as they were then. And in my opinion, there maybe is no better example than that than here in British Columbia. A province that, as beautiful as it is, and as much as we all love to live here, is becoming an unaffordable place to call home. And it's not simply that government has failed to address the problem in many cases. It's that government has actually been the problem. For example, with real estate, the incompetence of many local governments, particularly in Victoria and Vancouver, has led to an over-regulation of development, preventing the housing supply from growing sufficiently to meet demand. Young British Columbians specifically have, in many cases, either been forced to take on massive levels of debt or been shut out of the market completely. And when it comes to ride sharing in BC, both the NDP and the BC Liberals have failed to just get out of the way to a point where it's just embarrassing now. It's the largest city, Vancouver is the largest city in North America without ride sharing. When tourists and business leaders visit BC, they are perplexed at how modern cities like Victoria, like Vancouver, like even Kelowna and Nanaimo don't have ride-sharing options, while residents are stuck with sky-high cab fares, even though a cheaper, more convenient option is readily available. And then there's the war on BC drivers. On April 1st, the carbon tax in this province was increased for a 6th time, meaning higher prices at the pumps for BC drivers across the province. And on top of all this, the initial pledge to keep the tax revenue neutral has been abandoned completely by the current government. Instead, that additional money, out of the pockets of hardworking British Columbians like you, will remain in government coffers, plowed back into whatever pet projects our politicians see fit. And let's not forget, and it's hard not to forget at this with the gas that I think it was $1.57 around here when I was driving up, that we're already being hammered by 5 different taxes each time we go to fill up our tanks. They include the 10 cent a liter federal excise tax, 14 cent a liter provincial equivalent, and regional transit taxes as high as 17 cents a liter in Vancouver. Now, at least in theory, many of these levies are supposed to go towards the maintaining of roads and building of transit, even though they often don't. The BC carbon tax, on the other hand, has the sole purpose of punishing you for driving. And it's not just gasoline. The new carbon tax, while I'm speaking federally, or the current carbon tax in BC, will also increase home heating bills for millions of Canadians, while at the same time inflating the cost of everyday goods like groceries and housing as well. It is truly a regressive tax. The truth is, someone driving themselves to work or their kids to school should not be the target of government coercion and contempt. It's just that simple. But to be fair, there are certain individuals who may welcome a carbon tax. For example, if you're out shopping for groceries and you see the price of various fruits and vegetables and you think to yourself, I wish I could pay more for these exact same goods, then the carbon tax might be the tax for you. Or if you live in Ottawa, if you live in Calgary or Regina and it's minus 30 out and you got your furnace cranked and you're thinking to yourself, geez, I hope my home heating bill is the highest it's ever been this month, then the carbon tax is the tax for you. And if you're filling up your tank in Vancouver, Victoria, or here in Duncan, where gas is hovering around $1.50 a liter, as high as $1.70, $1.78 I think it got to in Vancouver, and you're watching the total shoot up, $50, $60, $70, and you're thinking to yourself, why isn't gas more expensive? I really wish that I could pay more than the carbon tax is the tax for you. And while yesterday you may have seen that the carbon tax was upheld as constitutional by the Saskatchewan Court of Appeals. It will now, of course, go to the Supreme Court of Canada. But the most important trial will be in the Court of Public Opinion this October. That's the trial. That will be when voters have a chance to deliver their final verdict on abolishing this coercive tax. And while we're on the topic of government coercion, how about everyone's favorite government monopoly, ICBC? Handing out massive new bonuses to their CEO and senior executives. I mean, seriously, how tone deaf can you possibly be? Now, it would be one thing. I don't mind bonuses under the right circumstance. It would be one thing if ICBC had been performing well, turning up profit for BC taxpayers, say, or lowering rates on BC drivers. That might make sense. But that's the exact opposite of what's been happening. Instead, ICBC has literally been driving itself off a cliff, losing over $1 billion last year alone. And instead of lowering rates on BC drivers while doing this, they just raised them again, over 6%, even though British Columbians already pay more for their auto insurance than anywhere else in the country, and it's not even close. In 5 short years, ICBC has gone from bad to worse to an outright dumpster fire. And instead of accountability, all taxpayers get is more waste, more mismanagement, and more excuses. So what's been the response from our politicians from both parties here in British Columbia? Instead of making the tough, necessary decisions that might upset a handful of special interests, they continue to do what they do best, reaching into the pockets of ratepayers, using your hard-earned money as a politically expedient band-aid for a problem that they've let grow out of control.
That's right.
And unfortunately, we don't have too many options here in this province, so I don't like picking on the BC Liberals too much, but ICBC isn't the only place where they fell short during their time in power. Their mismanagement of BC Hydro was arguably even worse, wasting over $16 billion in ratepayer money, your money, buying power it didn't even need. A decision that will cost the average ratepayer $200 a year for the next 20 years. That's a huge amount of money. And it wasn't even an accident. They did it on purpose, choosing to pay small Mickey Mouse power producers 4 times the market rate to produce power, like wind and solar, for which there was no demand. I mean, seriously, solar power in BC. I mean, this day except we're getting a little bit of sun right now, but in parts of BC, there is marginally more sun than the dark side of the moon. And just for clarification, these contracts weren't even the idea of BC Hydro executives, but rather they were thrust upon the corporation by our own politicians. And then there's the provincial debt. During the BC Liberals' time in power, the net debt of this province increased nearly 50%. Although, in fairness, it pales in comparison to the fiscal carnage being wrought by Justin Trudeau in Ottawa. During the 2015 election, the then candidate promised modest deficits, not more than $10 billion, and a balanced budget by 2019. Fast forward 4 years later, and we have a government who saddled future generations with over $80 billion in new debt for no apparent reason and with no discernible benefit, catapulting Canada's debt to over $687 billion, the federal debt, a debt that continues to grow by more than $54 million each day. And they still don't have a plan to return us to balance. And this right now is an economy that's somewhat humming along. Imagine if we go into a recession. It's a complete disaster for future generations and a complete and utter abandonment of their election promise. But before digging too deep into the presents, let's take a look at how we got here. How we accumulated, if you include the provinces, over $1 trillion in debt. And to be fair, because we have to be fair when discussing these issues, Justin Trudeau did not create the debt problem. It's not just his fault. It's more of a family project. Like, if we're going to be honest, it's more of a family project. In 1970, Pierre Trudeau introduced a nominal deficit of just $1 billion. In the words of our current Prime Minister, a modest deficit. The thing is, these modest deficits, as we've seen recently, have a tendency to beget, let's say, not so modest deficits. At the time, Canada's total federal debt was a mere 20 billion. As a reminder, it's over 687 billion today. Yet over the rest of his tenure, Trudeau Sr. would introduce a further 12 deficit budgets in a row, gradually growing in size and unmanageability. In total, by the time Chrétien balanced the budget in 1997, Canada had run a whopping 27 consecutive deficits, accumulating an additional $589 billion in debt. A shocking level of fiscal mismanagement, the legacy of which we still live with and pay for today. And what are the consequences of all this debt? Well, every marginal dollar, as I'm sure many of you know, borrowed by the government has a cost, a real, tangible cost. Governments in Canada throw away over $50 billion a year in tax dollars paying interest on the debt. That's money that can't go towards roads, towards education. That's money that can't go towards national defense. 10 cents of every dollar you pay in taxes, down the drain. Over $1,500 per Canadian, per each one of you, money that could be in your pocket each year, squandered paying interest. It is the single largest case of government waste in this country and the greatest abuse of tax dollars, period. Don't believe me? Think about this. Since 1990, governments in Canada have borrowed $733 billion additionally. In that same period of time, since 1990, we have spent $1,514 billion on interest payments. Does that sound like a good return on investment to you? Of course, having to pay the interest on all this debt also leaves less money for important government priorities. As I said, like providing our men and women in uniform with the funding and equipment they deserve. Important procurement of Navy ships, of Army trucks, and Air Force helicopters have all been delayed by years. And while this government's decision to scrap the acquisition of modern fighter jets has been a complete disaster, choosing to replace them instead with, this was incredibly hard to comprehend. When I first saw this headline in the newspaper, I thought I was reading it wrong, with near identical 30-year-old planes from Australia. And the latest refrain from debt apologists across the country has been to use our temporary low interest rates to borrow billions more. This would put us in an even more precarious situation when rates inevitably do rise. What we should do instead is take the proven fiscally conservative approach, taking advantage of this temporary reprieve in rates, and it is an advantage, to pay down as much debt as possible, reducing our exposure once interest rates inevitably do rise in the future. And we need to be all the more careful with our politicians. For if we give them a pass on borrowing, on debt, on deficits, make no mistake, we're giving them a license to spend, a license to waste, a license to perpetually increase the size of government, and a license to plunge future generations forever deeper and deeper into debt, and we can't let that happen. Now, I want to take this opportunity to push back on a couple fallacies, three different fallacies pushed by proponents of government borrowing. First, the cause of all this debt. Proponents of government borrowing are quick to cry austerity whenever a politician begins to muse about holding the line on spending or, God forbid, trimming the fat in government. The truth is, government spending in this country has been out of control for quite some time. Since 1999, government program expenditure in Canada has increased by 66% when adjusted for inflation. During that same period of time, population growth in this country has only been 17%. So clearly, the debt problem in Canada is one created by the politicians themselves and the chorus of special interest groups telling them to spend, spend, spend. Debt and deficits are not the consequence of circumstances beyond their control. Second, how much debt there is. Many politicians, and this is especially true for BC, will point to, quote, operational surpluses in an attempt to claim fiscal prudence, ignoring major government expenditures like roads and hospitals and bridges. This creates the awkward and confusing situation of a government claiming a surplus, like here in BC, while the debt continues to grow unabated. The truth is, all government debt is equal. All the money that is borrowed and taxed goes into one giant pot and is spent on a variety of government services. The creditors don't care if you borrowed money to build a road or pay teachers. Debt is debt, and it all costs interest. And can we dispense once and for all with the notion that government debt is anyway like a mortgage? This drives me insane. Governments do not repay their debt through installments like a mortgage. The debt is not backed by assets like a mortgage. The debt is not being used to finance an item that otherwise would have been unaffordable for the individual purchaser like a mortgage. The debt is not used to purchase an asset that can generate a reliable revenue stream like a mortgage. But unlike a mortgage, the debt is being left to future generations to pay for. They are the ones who, unbeknown to them, have been left a massive financial burden by politicians addicted to spending. At the same time, an aging population will put even more pressure on government finances. Yet on university campuses across the country, the very same generation most adversely impacted by these policies are the ones with the least exposure to their alternatives. From their classroom pulpits, professors espouse their views on an array of topics from climate change to gender expression, but little thought is spared to the sustainability of our nation's finances. That's why when I was at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we felt compelled to bring our message directly to students. We felt compelled to fight back. So we started the Generation Screwed campaign, a nationwide initiative to raise awareness about debts, deficits, and unfunded liabilities on university campuses across the country. During my 3 years running Generation Screwed, we reached tens of thousands of students and established a permanent presence on over 30 university campuses from coast to coast. We held events, seminars, training workshops, and toured the iconic CTF debt clock to schools in province after province. We even got 10 candidates in the Conservative Party leadership race, including Andrew Scheer, to sign the Future Generations Protection Pledge, committing that candidate, should he ever become Prime Minister, to do 3 things. To present a balanced budget to the House of Commons within 24 months after taking office, stopping the federal debt clock. After the budget is balanced, to commit to only running balanced budgets in all times outside of war and natural disaster. And because simply treading water is not enough, legislating a debt repayment schedule, dedicating a portion of annual revenues towards eliminating the debt. Now, whether on campuses in BC or elsewhere across the country, the experience of our coordinators and volunteers was always the same. Over and over again, students approached our booths and displays, armed with probing questions and an open mind. Once you presented them with the facts, they got it. Something about perpetual borrowing with the promise of a brighter future just doesn't add up. Add to this our aging population and soaring healthcare costs, and the picture becomes even clearer. And it's important this message reach young Canadians that have so much at stake, because this is an important issue, not just economically, but ethically as well. And I'd like to leave you with a metaphor on this that I think perfectly encapsulates the morality of government borrowing. So you know, at a Tim Hortons drive-thru, people sometimes pay it forward. You drive up to the window only to find out the person in front of you has paid for your breakfast in addition to his as well. It's always a pleasant surprise. Well, government debt is the exact opposite of that. It's like driving up to the window with your $5 in hand, ready to pay for your Boston cream and your double-double, only to find out the guy in front of you didn't pay for his breakfast. Now you're on the hook for his as well as your own. It's simply not fair, and it's something that I hope that you'll join me in standing up against. Thank you very much.